Long-term regulation of blood pressure requires that we alter blood volume. And of course, how best to alter blood volume than to get rid of some of the water of the blood? That's the job of the kidneys. So the kidneys can do so directly by increasing or decreasing the amount of urine that's produced. So in the kidneys there are little filtration units that are called nephrons that you'll learn about when you do the urinary system. And within the nephrons there is a network of blood vessels, and blood comes into that network of blood vessels and it's filtered, and the cleaned up blood goes back into circulation. The water and the waste products then go through these long tubular structures, and if it stays in those long tubular structures, it ends up in the toilet as urine. So when the little filtration blood vessels have blood rushing into them, of course, there is pressure on that blood. And the more the blood volume pushing against those blood vessels, the higher the pressure, and that's going to increase the rate of filtration. So when blood pressure is high, more water is filtered out as the nephrons receive that blood. So the kidneys can directly produce more urine if blood pressure is high. So more filtered out, more urine. That's going to lead to a decrease in blood volume and a decrease in blood pressure. If blood pressure is low when that blood comes into the little filtration unit in the nephron, then the pressure is going to be less on the filter. So less water, less fluid pushing against that filter is going to lead to less being filtered out. So there's less filtrate formed, therefore less water leaving the blood, less urine being produced, and of course then that gives the body time to recuperate and build more blood up because we are saving that water. So if blood pressure is low, the kidneys filter less and less urine is produced. The indirect method involves hormones such as the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone pathway. So when blood pressure decreases, the kidneys release an enzyme called renin. Renin causes angiotensin II to be activated. Now we've already talked about angiotensin II causing vasoconstriction and increasing blood pressure. And I mentioned the other role that angiotensin had, and that is it causes the release of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. So the aldosterone then travels right back to the kidneys. And remember just a second ago I mentioned those little filtering units with the long tubes, right, that the water had to go through before it became urine. So I'm still talking about in the kidneys now. I'm not talking about the ureters filling the bladder. I'm not talking about the urethra. But inside the kidneys there are all these little tubes that are part of that filtration unit. And if something stays in the tube, it's going to become urine. Well, what aldosterone does is cause sodium-potassium pumps to be built and put in the walls of those little filtering tubes. Now let's think back what's happening here. Blood pressure has decreased, so we began this pathway that led to the release of aldosterone. Aldosterone caused sodium-potassium pumps to be built and put into the walls of that tube that's part of the filter. All right, so now we've got pumps in the tubes. Those pumps start pumping sodium out of the tubes. And we know that anywhere sodium goes, water is going to follow. So when the sodium comes out of the tube, it gets resorbed back into the bloodstream. That means water is going to follow it and get resorbed back into the bloodstream. So resorbing sodium and water into the blood increases blood volume. And that, of course, is going to increase blood pressure. So the urine is decreased because we got the water back out. So saving that water increases blood volume, increases blood pressure. The other thing that is going to happen will be a stimulation for the release of ADH, antidiuretic hormone. Remember we mentioned this one a while ago and said that it causes vasoconstriction, is sometimes called vasopressin. Well, the ADH also causes little holes to be poked in those same tubes, but these holes are called aquaporins. What does aqua mean? Water. Pore, hole. So we're poking water holes in that tube. But the same thing happens. We just don't have the sodium as a part of the ADH pathway. So the ADH causes aquaporins to be poked in the tube, and it's just like poking holes in a water hose. The water's not going to go out the other end, right? Exactly. So the water doesn't end up in the toilet. It ends up being resorbed back into the bloodstream, which causes an increase in blood volume, which causes an increase in blood pressure. The angiotensin is also going to cause the thirst center to be activated so that we increase our intake of water. That is going to also cause us to have more water in the digestive system, and that means more water to be resorbed across the wall of the intestines back into the blood. So all of this is causing an increase in blood volume, which in turn causes an increase in blood pressure. All right, so here you can see the whole pathway for the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone conversion and resorption of water. So the drop in blood pressure or drop in blood volume causes the kidneys to release renin. Okay, the liver makes an inactive form of angiotensin, angiotensinogen. Okay, see gen at the end, that usually means inactive. So angiotensinogen gets converted into angiotensin 1. The lungs release angiotensin converting enzyme, which turns angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. Angiotensin causes vasodilation. We saw that already. But it also comes down here and causes the adrenal glands, adrenal cortex, to release aldosterone. Aldosterone causes us to retain sodium and retain water, which means we get that back into the blood, increase blood volume, increase blood pressure. Yeah, I like hormones a little bit. All right, so here we have a nice little graphic that gives us a lot of information. So in response to decreased blood volume and blood pressure, the endocrine mechanism is going to release hormones that we just talked about, and that in turn increases blood volume and homeostasis is restored. The neural mechanism is going to stimulate the cardiovascular systems, cause the sympathetic, the accelerator, to be activated, speeding up the heart rate and cardiac output, and of course the epi and norepi will do the same and lead to some vasoconstriction. The baro and chemoreceptors will be stimulated, and they in turn will increase cardiac output. So remember, if you increase cardiac output and increase peripheral vasoconstriction, peripheral resistance, then homeostasis is restored and blood pressure and blood volume are back to normal. The ability of tissue to automatically adjust its blood flow to match its metabolic needs is called autoregulation. In tissues like the heart and skeletal muscle, demand for oxygen is high, need a lot of nutrients, need a lot of waste products removed. So this can increase physical activity or increase dramatically during physical activity. So autoregulation is important to making sure that we have increased blood flow to those tissues. Autoregulation also controls regional blood flow in the brain. So blood distribution to various parts of the brain changes dramatically depending on what you're doing mentally and physically. During a conversation, blood flow increases to your motor speech areas when you're talking and increases to the auditory areas when you're listening. So there are two types of stimuli that cause autoregulatory changes in blood flow. Physical changes: warming produces vasodilation, cooling produces vasoconstriction. In addition, smooth muscles in arterial walls exhibit what we call a myogenic response. It contracts more forcefully when it's stretched and relaxes when stretching is not as much. For example, if blood flow through an arteriole decreases, stretching of the arterial wall decreases. As a result, the smooth muscle relaxes, produces vasodilation, which increases blood flow. There are several types of cells that also are going to be responsible for these autoregulatory mechanisms, and that includes the cells that release some vasodilating and vasoconstricting chemicals. Some of the cells are white blood cells and platelets. We saw this when we were talking about hemostasis, right? Macrophages, endothelial cells, a lot of these can release chemicals that alter blood vessel diameter. Vasodilating chemicals released by metabolically active tissue cells include potassium, hydrogen ions, lactic acid, ATP. Another important vasodilator released by endothelial cells is nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is the chemical that's responsible for the vasodilation that leads to penile erection. Tissue trauma or an inflammatory response can cause the release of some of the vasodilators such as kinins and histamines. Vasoconstrictors include thromboxane A, which was a part of what we saw with the conversions of some of the blood clotting factors. There are superoxide radicals and serotonin released from platelets, and endothelial cells can release these endothelins. So the more that a tissue needs oxygen and nutrients, the more that the cardiovascular system will respond by causing those blood vessels in that area to dilate and receive more of those particular, or receive more blood, of course, carrying the oxygen and the nutrients.